Okay, so other public health concerns about population growth have to do with excess population. If you're reading the Ghost Map as your supplemental book, you'll see some pretty graphic descriptions about what happens when the population in a city outgrows its ability to maintain good hygiene. So we see as the demographic transition continues, we see more and more people alive in communities that really are not able, say rural communities that can't really sustain large population waves. And people go to cities because that's where they're able to get access to a better life, better jobs, better resources, that sort of thing. So in that population growth period, we see population start to settle in cities. Now those cities probably do not have the public health infrastructure, sanitation infrastructure to really support them, and we end up seeing crowding and poor sanitary conditions in those communities. One of the things that we really worry about is the spread of infectious disease in communities like this. We're seeing some really frightening repercussions about tuberculosis in these communities. If we think about, excuse me, third world, the slums or ghettos in large third world cities around the globe. If you think about what could happen if like a disease like Ebola made its way into one of those, maybe Mumbai or some cities in China, what kind of the toll that we'd see in terms of human life just with the crowding and the large concentration of people. So that's one of our real big public health concerns. Another one that in which infectious disease is really altering this pattern has to do with HIV and AIDS in Africa. So if we think back to that demographic transition slide, we'd be expecting countries in that transition for lifespans to continue to expand, right? More and more people are living to an older and older age. But what we're seeing with the HIV epidemic in Africa is that it's actually shortening life expectancies at the exact same time we'd be expecting them to continue to get longer. And that has to do just with the prevalence of the virus in those communities. More than 1 in 4 people in Swaziland in Africa has an active HIV infection, and 24 of the 25 countries with the highest infection rates of HIV are in Africa. So we are seeing, despite the fact that we'd be expecting that demographic transition to occur, we're actually seeing lifespans get shorter in those communities. Now, in terms of why birth rates are so high in the developing world, we've got a bunch of different complicated reasons, kind of back to why healthcare is so expensive. First of all, poverty and social instability. So we don't have the expectation that we are able to control our family size and that the children that we do have will be able to live to a healthy older age. So without those expectations that we may take for granted in developed countries, we do see larger family sizes and larger birth rates in the developing world. Another thing that's really important to this conversation is societies where women have lower status than men. Typically in a country, in a society like this, the real value that women provide is basically and essentially reproduction. So it's normal to see a woman who remains either pregnant or breastfeeding or recovering from childbirth throughout her adult life. These also tend to be societies where we see both prostitution and sexual violence, sexual assault, as common everyday occurrences. And then sometimes along with that social instability, we see countries where children are orphaned without a structure to take care of them and left to fend for themselves. Among young women, we can see birth rates start even earlier in those populations. And then also access to the knowledge and resources for prevention are key. If birth control is not easily available in your country or you don't have the information about how to use it, that can definitely lead to high birth rates as well. So it's a complicated problem. We do have a couple of solutions that we'll be discussing when we get a few slides in. Right now, let's talk about that implication of large human populations. Same as if you're growing cells in a petri dish, right? You have to have a certain amount of growth medium available. When the growth medium runs out, then the cells stop growing. Same thing with people. The growth medium that we're talking about here, let's talk about fresh water, thinking back to our environmental health lectures. We have lots and lots of needs for this. We've got drinking water, cooking water, washing, growing plants. We do know that fresh water supplies are unevenly distributed across the globe. So countries that have large and growing populations at this time tend not to be the ones that are associated with large supplies of fresh water. I talked a little bit about political instability associated with water shortages in our environmental health lectures. So this is that same basic idea. We also have to talk about the availability of fuel, right? People everywhere need to cook their food. And if you don't have the ability to turn on an electric stove or, turn on a gas oven, you need to find a way to make that happen, to warm water, to cook food. And in many places around the globe, people still burn wood for this. Now, when we collect that wood to burn it, and there's lots and lots and lots of people doing the same thing, we end up with deforestation. So a lot of people cutting down a lot of trees to run a lot of cooking fires that leads to a loss of the trees in the area, which can contribute to problems like erosion and flooding as well. Another important part of this is that this is typically considered a women's job in many societies, both the obtaining water and obtaining fuel. So if we think about the kinds of influences that can bring a society out of this stage, greater economic achievement, by having half of the population that's dedicated to these tasks, we take them out of the economic arena in their society as well. Another problem that we run into with growing human populations is just the ability to grow enough food to support them, right? We're currently a little under 7.5 billion. We're looking at 2 billion more people over the next couple of decades. How are we going to feed them? We only have so much land available, and the amount that we use to grow food is currently declining. We do have some technology solutions that we think will be helpful here. Things like aquaponics, hydroponics, that sort of thing. But an interesting thing to consider here is dietary choice as well. We currently do grow enough food to feed all of our people, but we take about 40% of the grain that we grow and we feed that then to livestock, to food animals, instead of to people. If we look at how that breaks down in terms of production in the U.S. alone, about 56 million acres of land here in the U.S. is used to produce hay for food animals, and about 4 million used to produce vegetables. So less than a tenth there to produce food that people immediately eat. And of course, this is inefficient if we think about ecological systems. Every time we move up a step in a food chain, we lose about 90% of the energy that was collected. So if we grow the vegetables that go to feed people directly, we can conserve more than if we take that vegetable product and give it to an animal instead. For a long time, we thought that the oceans were going to be our backup resource here. But we've actually have ended up at a spot where about 75% or 3/4 of our major fish stocks are either fully exploited, overexploited, or have been overexploited for so long that they're considered significantly depleted. So this idea of relying on fish or shellfish as the food for the coming generations is probably something that we need to reconsider as well. And then, of course, we've also got at the same time, this idea of climate change. And that depending on which researcher you talk to, we see predictions between 3 and 7 degrees total temperature rise during the 21st century. And of course, this tends to be an issue that folks in your age group are very familiar with. One of our big concerns there is melting of the polar ice caps and rising sea levels. And then also changing weather patterns. We're going to see wet places get wetter, dry places get drier. Think of that again in terms of how we grow food and what that can mean in terms of large-scale food production or famine, especially as we see population increase and temperature increase happening at the same time. Of course, we know that contribution to climate change is not proportional to population size either. The U.S., with 5% of the world population, is contributing almost 20% of the greenhouse gases that are created. We do know that developing countries are also large contributors, and one of the things that we're trying to work towards is a solution that's equitable for all kinds of societies around the world. I have a lot of hope that folks in your generation are going to be able to work more productively with this than the ones in mine. Okay, so what do we do about it? What works? Obviously, this isn't an issue that's new. It's something that we spent a lot of time considering and working on. One of the first big conferences was run by the UN on population growth, was run by the UN in Cairo in 1994. Contraception tends to be a complicated moral issue for folks in certain religions, and we do know that both Roman Catholics and Muslims find that it violates the tenets of their religion. We see this back and forth again between rich and poor countries that we see with climate change, but we do know that if we're going to do one thing that will help to reduce population size. It's education for women. We talked about low social status of women being a risk factor for large family sizes. When we educate women, we see the opposite, especially if we combine that with access to family planning tools. If we are able to raise the status of women in a society, it tends to speak of some good things about the society itself. So we've got those kinds of healthy pressures going there, but also the ability of women to control their own reproductive rights tends to go along with that. And we see family size decline then as well. One thing we do know is that trying to do this by force or by legal approaches does tend to be very complicated. We've seen a model of that currently in China. But we do know that if we can help to modernize economies and sustain those economies and the families in the area, that can also happen on its own as well. So that's kind of our run through population control. We're going to take a break here, and then we'll pick back up again, and we'll talk about aging and the aging population and healthy aging. Thank you.